I was sitting behind the wheel of my truck, driving along a desolate highway that stretched through the middle of nowhere. It was one of those nights when every sound seemed louder, and every movement at the edge of my vision felt like a threat. The moon hung low, and the road ahead was so dark that even with my high beams on, it felt like I was driving into a void. I had been on the road for hours, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio to keep me company. There was something unsettling about being so isolated. No cars, no towns, just the endless stretch of asphalt. I tried to shake the feeling, but something in the pit of my stomach told me tonight wasn't like other nights. The CB radio crackled, breaking the silence. Static mostly, but then a voice. Faint, distorted, but I could just make it out. "Anybody out there?" It was a man's voice, strained, almost desperate. I picked up the receiver. "Yeah, I'm here. You good?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my pulse quickened for no reason I could explain. There was silence for a moment. Then the voice returned, weaker this time. I need help. Something's out here." My grip tightened on the wheel. This stretch of highway wasn't known for much, except the occasional coyote or deer. Nothing dangerous, at least not that I'd ever encountered. "What's the problem?" I asked, glancing into my side mirrors, half expecting to see something out of the ordinary. But there was nothing but darkness. "Can't explain it." His voice trembled. "Just don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." A chill ran down my spine. "Where are you?" I asked, scanning the horizon. There was no answer. Just static. I clicked the radio off, my heart beating a little faster. The road stretched on ahead, and in the distance, I could just make out the faint glow of headlights, barely visible through the haze of the desert night. Another trucker, maybe? Relief washed over me briefly, but it quickly turned into something else. The headlights weren't moving. As I got closer, I realized the truck was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down, instinctively cautious. The cab was dark. No signs of life. I debated pulling over to check, but the warning from the radio echoed in my head, "Don't stop." I kept driving. But as I passed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the truck's cab was wide open, and hanging from the side was a hand, motionless, pale under the moonlight. I could barely make it out in the dim light, but it was enough to know something was very wrong. I floored the gas pedal. For a long while, I drove faster than I should have, my eyes flicking between the road and the mirrors, half expecting something to follow me. But nothing did. Just the endless, empty road. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something in the distance. A figure. A man, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt, tires skidding against the asphalt. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly turned to face me. He was gaunt, his clothes torn, his face obscured by the shadows. But his eyes, they glowed. Not the reflective shine you see from animals in the night. This was something unnatural, something wrong. And then he smiled. Not a normal smile. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, and the skin around his lips cracked as though it hadn't moved in years. My stomach churned, every instinct screaming at me to drive. But I was frozen. Frozen in place as he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. And then another. The radio crackled again, the same voice from earlier. "Don't stop. I told you not to stop." With a shaking hand, I shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas. The figure disappeared from my headlights, but the terror didn't leave me. I drove for what felt like hours, never daring to slow down. My mind raced, replaying the moment again and again. What the hell had I just seen? I was miles from the truck I'd passed, miles from the figure in the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Sitting in the passenger seat. That same smile, wide and broken. I swerved, nearly losing control of the truck. When I looked again, he was gone. But the smile stayed with me. I didn't stop again until I reached the next truck stop, the lights of the diner glowing like a beacon of safety. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't look back at the truck. I couldn't. I never drove that stretch of highway again. And to this day, I still hear his voice on the radio sometimes. "Don't stop, whatever you do. Don't stop." And I never will. I sat in the diner, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that I hadn't touched. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of greasy food filled the air, but all I could focus on was the memory of that face. That smile. I must have looked like hell, because the waitress gave me a concerned look as she refilled my cup for the third time without saying a word. I wasn't sure how much time had passed since I stumbled in, but the adrenaline that had kept me going for hours had finally started to wear off, leaving me drained and jittery. I glanced out the window at my truck, sitting in the parking lot. Even though I knew it was just a machine, part of me wondered if whatever I had seen out on that highway was still in there, waiting for me to get back behind the wheel. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was just exhaustion or the isolation messing with me, that smile haunted me. The way his eyes glowed in the darkness, and the voice on the radio. It all felt too real. The door to the diner jingled as another customer walked in, shaking me from my thoughts. A man, another trucker, by the look of his worn jacket and heavy boots, sat at the counter. He glanced in my direction, nodding in that casual way truckers acknowledge each other, but I didn't nod back. I couldn't. He ordered coffee, and as the waitress poured it, he pulled out a cigarette and lit it. The sharp smell of tobacco mixed with the grease in the air, but I barely noticed. My mind was still on the highway, still on that figure, that smile. Then the man spoke, his voice rough from years of smoking. "You see it too, didn't ya?" My head snapped up, and I stared at him, my heart suddenly racing again. "What?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He took a drag of his cigarette, then exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Out on 375. The highway. You saw him." I didn't respond at first. How could he know? How could he possibly know what I'd seen? The man chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "Don't worry, you're not the first. Hell, you won't be the last either. He's been out there for years. Longer than I've been on the road, that's for damn sure." I swallowed hard, the coffee in my hand forgotten. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What is he?" The trucker shrugged. "No one knows. Some say he was a driver, just like us. Got lost out there one night, in the middle of a storm, and never found his way back. Others say he's something else. Something older. But it doesn't matter who or what he is." He took another drag of his cigarette, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What matters is that once you see him, once he sees you, you're marked." "Market?" My throat went dry, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Yeah." He flicked the ash from his cigarette into the tray, his expression grim. "He'll follow you. Maybe not right away. Maybe not for a long time. But he'll come for you. And when he does, you better hope you're ready." I stared at him, my mind racing. "How do you stop him?" The trucker shook his head slowly. "You don't. There's no stopping him. Only thing you can do is keep moving. Don't stop for nothing. Not for a broken down car, not for a hitchhiker, not for anything. Keep driving and maybe, just maybe, you'll outrun him." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "And if you don't?" He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "If you stop, if you slow down, he'll take you. And you'll never be seen again." The diner suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I couldn't sit here any longer, couldn't listen to this. It was too much. Too real. "I need to go," I muttered, standing up on shaky legs. I threw some crumpled bills on the table, not waiting for change. The trucker didn't try to stop me. He just watched, a knowing look in his eyes, as I stumbled out of the diner and back into the night. The parking lot was dark, the neon lights of the diner casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. My truck loomed ahead, the engine silent, the cab dark. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle, half expecting to see that smiling face in the passenger seat again. But the cab was empty. I climbed in, my heart pounding, and started the engine. The roar of the motor filled the silence, a small comfort in the otherwise oppressive darkness. I pulled out of the parking lot, heading back onto the highway. And as I drove into the night, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the vast emptiness of the desert, he was still watching. And he was waiting. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black cutting through the desert, the glow of the diner's lights fading behind me. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:13 a.m. The darkest hour of the night, and it felt like the shadows outside the truck were pressing in closer. My headlights barely seemed to penetrate the gloom, and the road ahead was swallowed by the vast emptiness. I tried to shake off the trucker's words, tried to tell myself it was all just stories. Urban legends passed around between truckers to keep each other awake on long hauls. But deep down, I knew better. The thing I had seen wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. And it was out there. The thought made my skin crawl. I turned the radio on, hoping the static would drown out the silence, but it only made things worse. Every crackle, every blip of noise had me on edge, waiting for that voice to come through again.
Don't stop.
I turned the volume down, my hands shaking slightly. I hadn't felt fear like this before.
Not even close.
And no matter how much I tried to focus on the road, my eyes kept drifting to the mirrors, to the back of the cab, expecting to see that thing again, sitting there, smiling. A flash of movement caught my attention in the rearview mirror. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The truck jerked to a stop, the engine humming quietly. For a moment, I just sat there, my breathing shallow, waiting. But there was nothing.
No movement.
No sound, except for the faint hum of the truck's engine. I cursed under my breath. It had been nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. I shifted back into gear and started rolling again, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The desert seemed even more oppressive now, as though it was waiting for something. As the miles ticked by, the weariness started to settle in. My eyelids grew heavier, and I blinked hard trying to stay focused. I couldn't afford to fall asleep.
Not here. Not now.
The trucker's warning echoed in my mind, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, reminding myself, keep moving.
Don't stop.
But then, just as my mind began to drift, I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light.
A mirage, maybe.
But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't my imagination. There, on the side of the road, was a woman. She was standing next to a car, a beat-up old sedan with its hood popped open, steam billowing from the engine. Her figure was silhouetted against the dim glow of her car's hazard lights, her hand raised in a half-hearted wave.
I felt my heart skip a beat.
I slowed down, my headlights illuminating her as I approached. She looked scared, desperate even. She was young, maybe in her 20s, her hair a tangled mess, and her face pale under the harsh light of my truck's beams. My first instinct was to stop.
To help.
It was a dangerous stretch of road to be stranded on in the middle of the night, and she didn't look like she had a phone or any way to get help. But then the trucker's words came flooding back.
Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop.
I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. She looked so helpless, standing there in the middle of nowhere. But there was something wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep going. The woman stepped forward, waving both arms now, her face twisted in panic.
Please.
Please help me, she shouted, her voice cracking in the cold night air. I gripped the wheel tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, torn between the urge to stop and the overwhelming sense of dread building inside me. And then I noticed it.
The smile.
It was faint, just a twitch at the corners of her lips, barely noticeable.
But it was there. And it was wrong.
Her eyes, wide and pleading, didn't match the small creeping smile that played across her face. Cold terror shot through me. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding past her without looking back. In my side mirror, I saw her drop her arms, standing motionless in the road as my truck roared away. My heart pounded in my ears, and my hands shook on the steering wheel. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, even though my brain screamed at me to turn around, to see if she was really in trouble.
But I knew.
Deep down, I knew she wasn't human.
Or at least, not anymore.
For the next hour, I drove in silence, too terrified to even look in the mirrors, afraid I'd see her, or something worse, following me. The road stretched on, empty and lifeless, and all I could do was pray I wouldn't see anyone else. But as I approached the next truck stop, relief washed over me. The bright neon sign flickered in the distance, a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. I had made it.
I was safe. Or so I thought.
As I stepped out of the truck and headed toward the diner, something caught my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart seizing in my chest. Parked at the far end of the lot was the same beat-up sedan.
The one with the hood popped open.
And standing next to it, her face illuminated by the flickering neon lights, was the woman.
She smiled.
That same, twisted smile.
And she waved. I turned and ran.
I bolted for the diner, my heart hammering so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. My legs felt like they were moving through thick mud, every step slower than it should have been, but I didn't dare stop. Not even for a second. I slammed through the door of the diner, the bell jingling above my head as I stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The few people inside, another trucker nursing a cup of coffee, a couple sitting at the counter, and the same waitress I'd seen earlier, turned to look at me. Their faces blurred together as I frantically glanced around, trying to convince myself that what I'd just seen wasn't real. That woman, she couldn't have been here. Couldn't have followed me. I backed up against the wall, my hand instinctively reaching for the door, ready to run back out if I saw her approaching. My mind raced. How could she have gotten here before me? There was no way. It was impossible. But I knew what I'd seen. The waitress, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes, approached cautiously, her brows furrowed in concern. "You okay, Han?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with suspicion. I didn't know how to respond. The words were trapped in my throat, my mind trying to make sense of the impossible. Did you see her?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. The waitress blinked, confused.
"See who?"
I turned, pointing out the window, but the parking lot was empty. The beat-up sedan, the woman, everything was gone. My hand dropped to my side, trembling. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. There was a woman. She was right there, I muttered, my voice cracking with panic. The trucker at the counter gave me a long, hard look, then shook his head, muttering something under his breath about another one losing it on the road. The waitress placed a hand on my arm, gently guiding me to a booth. "You've been on the road too long, honey. Sit down, take a breather. Maybe get some coffee in you." I let her guide me, my mind still whirling with images of that twisted smile, those glowing eyes. I slumped into the booth, my hands shaking as I reached for the cup she placed in front of me. The coffee was hot, scalding even, but I barely felt it. The door jingled again, and I stiffened, my head snapping toward the entrance, expecting to see her walk through. But it was just another trucker, a heavy-set man with a scruffy beard. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and forced myself to take a sip of coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I sat there, trying to collect my thoughts, I felt eyes on me. Not from inside the diner, but from outside. Slowly, almost against my will, I turned to the window.
And there she was.
Standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the neon lights, was the woman. Her face was half hidden in shadow, but I could see her smile.
Wide. Broken.
That same horrible smile that seemed to stretch too far, like her skin was tearing apart. I gasped and jerked back, knocking over the coffee cup. The hot liquid spilled across the table, but I didn't care. My eyes were locked on her, my pulse pounding in my ears. She raised her hand, just like before, and waved.
Slow. Deliberate.
I shot to my feet, my heart racing. The waitress hurried over, worry etched on her face. "What's wrong?" "She's out there." I nearly screamed, pointing at the window. "She's right there." The waitress turned, following my gaze. But when she looked outside, her expression softened into one of pity. "There's no one out there, Han," she said gently, as if talking to a child who had just woken up from a nightmare. I pressed my face to the glass, my breath fogging up the window. The parking lot was empty again.
She was gone.
But I knew she'd been there.
I knew it.
My pulse was still racing as I stumbled back from the window. The trucker at the counter gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I had to get out of here. I had to keep moving. Without another word, I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door, ignoring the calls from the waitress as I ran toward my truck. I jumped into the cab, locking the doors behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the lot as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless, but I floored it, the truck's engine straining as I pushed it to the limit. My eyes flicked to the mirrors, scanning the road behind me, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the highway again, but there was nothing. For miles, I drove in silence, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the thudding of my heart in my ears. The world outside the truck seemed to blur together, just shadows and darkness, with no beginning or end. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, to stay focused, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life. My breath caught in my throat. The static buzzed, and then faintly, I heard it.
"Don't stop."
The voice was different this time.
Softer. More distorted.
But I recognized it immediately.
It was her.
I yanked the radio off the dashboard and threw it to the floor, my hands shaking uncontrollably.
I wasn't stopping. Not for anything.
But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, somewhere in the darkness, following me. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her. Sitting in the passenger seat, smiling that same, terrible smile. I swerved, the truck lurching wildly as I struggled to regain control.
When I looked again, she was gone. But I knew. She wasn't gone.
She never would be. And no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I ran, she would always find me.
Because once you see her,
you're never really alone again. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was unraveling, fear twisting tighter around me with every mile, every second. I had been driving for hours now, refusing to stop, refusing to let the terror catch up to me. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how much distance I tried to put between myself and what had happened, it didn't matter. She was always there. I could feel her, sitting just out of sight, like a shadow waiting to pounce. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her again, her smile cracking wider, her eyes hollow and glowing. But every time I looked, she wasn't there. Yet somehow, that was worse. The waiting, the uncertainty. My vision blurred with exhaustion, but stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant giving in. Stopping meant letting her get closer. As I barreled down the highway, the landscape around me grew more indistinct, the desert blending into an endless stretch of nothing. The lights of small towns had long disappeared, and now there was only the road ahead, an empty void that seemed to stretch into infinity. Then, out of the darkness, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. My heart pounded in my ears, and I stared out the windshield, my breath coming in ragged gasps.
It was her.
She stood in the center of the highway, bathed in the glow of my headlights. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn, and her skin as pale as death. But it was the smile that froze me in place. That same awful smile, stretched too wide, as though her face was breaking apart.
I couldn't move. I couldn't think. She took a step forward, then another. Slow. Deliberate.
Her eyes, those horrible glowing eyes, locked onto mine. I slammed the truck into reverse, but before I could hit the gas, something hit the passenger window.
A hand.
Pale, twisted fingers smeared against the glass. She was there, right beside me, her smile growing even wider as she pressed her face against the window. I screamed, shoving the gearshift into drive and slamming my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway, swerving to avoid her.
But she didn't move. She didn't chase me. She didn't need to.
I could still see her, standing in the distance, getting smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. But I knew she was with me. She had been with me since the moment I'd seen her on that dark highway. And no matter how fast I drove, how far I tried to go, I couldn't escape. Because once you see her, she never really leaves. As the miles stretched on, I felt my grip on reality slipping. My body was trembling with exhaustion, my mind barely holding on. The hum of the engine blurred with the drumming of my heartbeat, and soon I wasn't even sure what was real anymore. In the mirrors, I kept seeing her. On the side of the road.
Standing in the shadows.
Sitting in the passenger seat. Always smiling. Always watching. And I realized then, there was no escape. I couldn't outrun her. I couldn't drive fast enough, far enough. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. I had been marked. The trucker at the diner had been right all along. She had seen me. And now she would always find me. Always. In the distance, the horizon was starting to glow faintly with the coming dawn, but it didn't bring any comfort. The night might have been ending, but I knew the nightmare never would. I kept driving, knowing there was nothing else I could do.
I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop.
Because stopping meant the end. And not just the end of the road. The end of everything. And as the sun slowly rose, casting long shadows across the desert, I knew one thing for certain. She was still with me. And she always would be.